Okay, so the central premise of the corporate form of ownership is that I can buy stock in a corporation and serve as an investor. And if that corporation gets sued or goes out of business, I don't have to worry about my personal assets being attached to a lawsuit, right? That's called limited liability of shareholders, all right? So that's the general rule, and it rarely does something other than that happen, but there is precedent for things to happen that allow courts to hold shareholders liable. All right, so what are those things? Well, we can reduce them to 5 categories. The first being, the first being when a party is tricked into doing business with a corporation. So one of the things that you've probably picked up on in the chapters leading up to this point is that when an entity has limited liability for its owners, it needs to indicate that in the name of the company, be it limited liability partnership, LLP, limited partnership, LP, right, or corporation, right? That needs to be in the title of the corporation, and that serves as a warning to would-be customers that when you do business with this entity, there is a limitation on liability. You can't sue the owners personally, right? Well, even something as simple as failing to include corporation in the official business name, right? That's misleading because otherwise I think I'm dealing with a sole proprietor or an owner who has personal liability. Or hypothetically, you could make up scenarios where just the name of the entity is misrepresented as something else, or an individual who is actually acting as an agent of a corporation uses his or her personal name and not the name of the corporation. And in that circumstance, if the customer didn't have the opportunity to appreciate that they were doing business with a corporation, then the person who misled the customer can be held personally liable. All right, so that's how that works. Shell corporations designed to be insolvent. Now, this varies from state to state. Some states have minimum capitalization requirements. Common number is $250,000. This means that if you form your corporation with less than that amount, shareholders can be held personally liable. Right? Or another example would be a corporation is really only a paper creation that is designed where when parties are injured, you sue the corporation, but there are no assets there to satisfy a lawsuit or a judgment. In those cases, courts may hold the shareholders liable. Corporation was formed to evade existing legal obligations. If there are obligations that exist for, say, a business changes entities from a partnership to a corporation, any liabilities that existed prior to the incorporation are not going to be subject to the corporate limitation on liability. The owners could be held liable. So you can't avoid existing obligations by incorporating. All right. Corporate formalities not followed. Well, this is very similar to the LLC, which we talked about. If state law requires that you have separate bank accounts, and you don't do that, well, that's corporate formalities are not being followed. A better example: if corporate state law requires that you make an annual filing with the Secretary of State and you fail to do that, you're not following the corporate formality. All right. And then, of course, commingling of funds, which is the exact same thing we discussed in the LLC chapter. So having personal expenses ran through the business or vice versa. Corporate liability for criminal acts and civil wrongs. All right. So, corporation can be held liable for criminal acts of its agents or employees. Generally, you're looking for acts that are done within the scope of employment, which goes back to the agency chapter, so we're already familiar with that. The key thing to know, doesn't relieve the agent or officer of liability from their own actions. In other words, if CEO commits a crime, the corporation can be held liable. Typically, corporations' liability is fines, right? Disgorgement, which is any profit made from that particular illegal act, is paid maybe as restitution to injured parties or fraudulently the parties who were defrauded, are injunctions, which is precluding the company from competing in a certain business for a period of time. All right. Similar rule for torts. Right. A corporation can be liable for torts committed in the scope of their employment. It's called respondent superior. Also discussed the very beginning of the term in the agency chapter. No real difference here. And once again, this does not relieve agents or officers of liability for their own torts. So when the corporation can be held liable for criminal acts and or torts, it never relieves the wrongdoer, the agent or the employee, from liability from their own actions.